Heavy metal has made some musicians obscenely wealthy.
Right here on the Sunset Strip with my buddy Michael Anthony. Woo, in the house!
We're talking about fortunes that would make Wall Street executives jealous. Bank accounts with 8 and 9 figures. Investment portfolios worth more than small countries' GDPs.
It was like a country house. Lemon tree, avocado tree, it was whack.
These metal legends have sold millions of albums, headlined the biggest festivals on the planet, and turned decades of touring into generational wealth. They could live in mansions, drive Ferraris, vacation on private islands, and never worry about money for the rest of their lives.
This is the kitchen. This is Leah's lair.
But they don't. Some of the richest people in heavy metal live like they're still broke, still struggling, still one bad gig away from bankruptcy.
One day it will be worth as much as $5.
And the reasons why reveal something fascinating about the psychology of metal musicians and the culture of the genre itself. This is the story of extremely rich heavy metal stars who live like they're poor. Musicians worth tens or hundreds of millions who drive old cars, live in modest houses, shop at discount stores, and refuse to embrace the lifestyle their wealth could provide. Some do it because they're genuinely humble. Some because they're terrified of losing everything. And some because living rich would betray everything heavy metal stands for. These are the millionaire metal gods who still live like regular people, and their stories will completely change how you think about wealth in the music industry. Let's start with the most extreme example, a metal musician so wealthy he could buy a small country, but chooses to live a lifestyle that most middle-class Americans would consider modest. Dave Mustaine, the founder and frontman of Megadeth, is worth an estimated $20 million. $20 million. That's conservative too. Some estimates put his net worth closer to 30 or 40 million when you factor in royalties, publishing rights, and decades of touring revenue. Dave Mustaine has made more money from heavy metal than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. And how does Dave live? He lives in a relatively modest home in Southern California. Not a mansion, not an estate with servants and security. A regular house in a regular neighborhood. He drives his own cars, nothing exotic or flashy. He shops at regular stores. He's been spotted countless times at grocery stores and hardware stores doing his own shopping like a completely normal person. People who meet Dave in public are always shocked because they expect a rock star worth tens of millions to have an entourage, to be driven around in limousines, to act like royalty. Instead, they find a guy buying light bulbs at Home Depot. Dave's lifestyle choices come from genuine trauma around money. He grew up poor, really poor, the kind of poverty that marks you permanently. His early years were unstable, his family struggled financially, and even after Megadeth became successful, Dave lived with the constant fear that it could all disappear. He's talked in interviews about having nightmares where he wakes up broke, where all the success was just a dream and he's back to having nothing. This fear drives Dave to live well below his means. He doesn't trust wealth. He doesn't believe it's permanent. So instead of spending like a multi-millionaire, he saves obsessively, invests conservatively, and lives like someone making a comfortable middle-class income. His accountants probably love him because he's not the typical rock star bleeding money on stupid purchases. But psychologically, Dave can't escape the poverty of his childhood, even though he's been rich for decades. Now let's talk about Tom Araya from Slayer, who we mentioned earlier for his spinal issues. Tom is worth an estimated $14 million. Slayer was one of the biggest thrash metal bands in history. They toured constantly for nearly 40 years, sold millions of albums, headlined festivals worldwide. Tom made a fortune from Slayer, and he lives in a regular suburban house in Southern California, drives normal cars, and lives a completely unglamorous life. Tom's lifestyle is partly about staying grounded and partly about his family. He's married with kids, and he wanted them to grow up normally, not as spoiled rich kids who think money grows on trees. So instead of buying a mansion and hiring staff, Tom lives in a house that looks like what a successful accountant or engineer might own. Nice, but not ostentatious. Comfortable, but not extravagant. People who know Tom say he's one of the most down-to-earth guys in metal. He doesn't act like a rock star. He doesn't demand special treatment. When Slayer was touring, Tom would hang out with crew members and treat everyone as equals. He never pulled the "I'm the star" routine. And that humility extends to how he manages his wealth. Tom could live like a king, but he chooses to live like a regular guy who happens to have a lot of money in the bank. Let's discuss Kerry King, also from Slayer, who has an estimated net worth of $8 million. Kerry is known for his intense stage presence and his collection of guitars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But outside of guitars, Kerry lives remarkably simply. He's not into cars, doesn't own multiple properties, doesn't collect art or jewelry. His big indulgence is his guitar collection, and even that is functional because he actually plays those guitars, rather than keeping them as investments. Kerry has said in interviews that he doesn't understand the rock star lifestyle of excess. He grew up working class, and even after decades of success with Slayer, he still thinks like a working class guy. He budgets. He saves. He doesn't waste money on stupid things. When Slayer finally retired in 2019 after their farewell tour, Kerry could have bought a massive retirement estate somewhere. Instead, he bought a comfortable house and settled into a quiet life that doesn't look much different from how he lived before he was rich. Now let's talk about one of the wealthiest people in all of heavy metal who lives in a way that will absolutely blow your mind. Rob Halford, the legendary vocalist for Judas Priest, is worth an estimated $30 million. $30 million. Judas Priest has been one of the most successful metal bands for over 50 years. They've sold over 50 million albums worldwide. They've toured constantly. Rob Halford is metal royalty, and his bank account reflects that. And Rob lives in a modest 2-bedroom condo, not a penthouse in some luxury building. A regular condo that you or I could probably afford if we saved up. Rob has talked about this in interviews, about how he doesn't need a big house because he's on tour so much anyway. He doesn't see the point in paying for and maintaining a massive property when he's rarely home. So he lives in a small, manageable space that meets his needs without wasting money. Rob also drives his own modest car, does his own shopping, and lives without the trappings of wealth that most celebrities embrace. He's been photographed countless times just walking around like a normal person. And fans are always shocked when they recognize him because there's nothing about his appearance or behavior that screams multi-millionaire rock star. Part of Rob's humble lifestyle comes from his personality. He's just not a flashy person. He doesn't care about showing off wealth. He doesn't need a mansion or a Bentley to feel successful. His success is measured by his music and his impact on heavy metal, not by how much expensive stuff he owns. And that mindset has kept him grounded despite being wealthy enough to live however he wants. Let's discuss James Hetfield from Metallica, though his case is a bit different because Metallica is so astronomically wealthy that even living modestly means something different. James is worth an estimated $300 million. $300 million. Metallica is one of the most successful rock bands in history. Period. They've sold over 125 million albums worldwide. Their tours gross hundreds of millions. Each member of Metallica could buy their own private island and still have money left over. But James lives relatively modestly compared to what his wealth would allow. He owns a ranch in Colorado where he lives a quiet life when not touring. He's into cars, but his collection is mostly classic American muscle cars and hot rods, not exotic Italian supercars. He builds and restores cars himself in his own garage, rather than just buying finished vehicles. He hunts, fishes, and spends time outdoors. His lifestyle is more successful rancher than rock god worth 9 figures. James has talked about how his childhood shaped his relationship with money. His family was comfortable but not wealthy, and his parents instilled values about work and not wasting resources. Even after Metallica became the biggest metal band on earth, James kept those values. He could live in a $100 million mansion in Beverly Hills, but instead he lives on a ranch where he can be outside and away from the industry. Now, James does own multiple properties and has definitely spent money on his passions like car restoration. So he's not living poor by any normal definition. But compared to what someone worth $300 million could do, compared to how other celebrities at that wealth level live, James is remarkably modest. He's not buying yachts or private jets or $100,000 watches. He's living a lifestyle that a successful small business owner might have. just scaled up a bit. Let's talk about Lars Ulrich, also from Metallica, who presents an interesting contrast. Lars is worth an estimated $350 million, making him one of the wealthiest musicians in any genre. And Lars does live more lavishly than the other musicians we've discussed. He owns expensive properties, collects fine art worth millions, and embraces a lifestyle befitting his wealth. But even Lars is relatively modest compared to what he could do. He could own a $100 million yacht. He could buy private islands. He could live like a tech billionaire. Instead, he lives in a very nice but not absurdly extravagant house in the Bay Area, collects art that he actually appreciates rather than just buying for investment, and lives a cultured, comfortable life without going completely overboard. The interesting thing about Lars is that he gets criticized in the metal community for living too lavishly, for not being humble enough, for acting like he's better than regular people. This reveals something important about heavy metal culture. There's an expectation that metal musicians should remain working class in their lifestyle even after they become wealthy. Fans want their metal heroes to stay relatable, to not become the rich elite they used to rebel against. Lars violated that unwritten rule by openly embracing his wealth, and the metal community has never fully forgiven him for it. Let's discuss Ozzy Osbourne, whose case is complicated because while he's worth an estimated $220 million, his lifestyle has been managed largely by his wife Sharon because of Ozzy's history of financial irresponsibility and substance abuse. Ozzy's natural inclination is actually to live modestly. When left to his own devices, he wears comfortable clothes that look like they came from a regular department store. He doesn't care about fancy cars or showing off wealth, and he's happiest just hanging out at home. But Sharon runs the Osbourne business empire, and she's invested their money wisely in real estate and other ventures. They own nice properties, but nothing compared to what $220 million could buy. And Ozzy himself doesn't seem to care about the wealth. He's talked about how money doesn't make him happy, how he'd be content living in a small apartment as long as he could make music. Ozzy's humble approach to wealth comes partly from his working-class roots in Birmingham, England. He grew up in genuine poverty, in a tiny house with no indoor bathroom, sharing beds with siblings. Even after Black Sabbath made him famous and wealthy, Ozzy never forgot where he came from. The trappings of wealth don't impress him, because he remembers when having enough to eat was a struggle. Now let's talk about Geezer Butler, the bassist and primary lyricist for Black Sabbath, who is worth an estimated $70 million. Geezer lives in a nice but modest home in California, drives regular cars, and lives a quiet life focused on his family and his vegetarian lifestyle. Geezer could live in a mansion with servants and luxury cars, but that's not who he is. Geezer has talked about how wealth makes him uncomfortable, how he feels guilty having so much when others have so little. He donates significant amounts to animal rights organizations and environmental causes. His relationship with money is complicated by his working-class background and his progressive political views. He made millions playing in one of the biggest metal bands ever, but ideologically, he's still aligned with the working class he came from. This creates an interesting tension. Geezer is a multimillionaire who philosophically believes that extreme wealth inequality is wrong. So he lives modestly, gives away significant portions of his wealth, and refuses to embrace the excessive lifestyle that his bank account could support. It's his way of staying true to his values, even though the music industry made him rich. Let's discuss Lemmy Kilmister, who died in 2015 with an estimated net worth of $10 million. That might not sound like a lot compared to some of the other musicians we've discussed, but for someone who lived as modestly as Lemmy did, $10 million is a fortune. Lemmy lived in a small apartment in Hollywood for decades, not a luxury condo, a small rent-controlled apartment that probably cost less per month than what some people pay for car payments. Lemmy's apartment was famously cramped and cluttered. It was filled with his collection of Nazi memorabilia, not because Lemmy was a Nazi, but because he was a World War II history buff. The apartment looked like what a struggling musician might live in, not what a legendary rock star worth millions could afford. Lemmy could have bought a house, could have lived in comfort and space, But he chose to stay in that apartment because it was familiar, because moving seemed like too much hassle, and because Lemmy genuinely didn't care about living in luxury. Lemmy spent his money on Jack Daniels, cigarettes, and slot machines at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, where he hung out almost every day. His lifestyle was simple: drink, play video poker, make music, repeat. He didn't need or want more than that. The fact that he had millions in the bank was almost irrelevant to how he actually lived his life. Now let's talk about why so many wealthy metal musicians choose to live modestly, because the psychology behind this is fascinating. First, there's the trauma of poverty. Many metal musicians grew up poor or working class. They experience genuine financial instability, and that creates a fear of being poor again that never goes away no matter how much money you accumulate. Dave Mustaine's nightmares about waking up broke, Ozzy's memories of sharing a bed with siblings. These experiences create psychological patterns that wealth can't erase. Second, there's the culture of heavy metal itself. Metal has always positioned itself as the music of the working class, the rejected, the outsiders. Embracing obvious wealth contradicts that identity. Metal fans don't want to see their heroes living in mansions and driving Rolls-Royces. They want their metal gods to remain relatable, to still be one of us, even after achieving success. Musicians who openly flaunt their wealth get accused of selling out, of betraying the working-class roots of the genre. Third, many metal musicians are genuinely humble people who don't equate happiness with material possessions. They've achieved their dreams by making music. They have enough money to never worry about bills. What more do they need? A bigger house doesn't make the music better. An expensive car doesn't make you a better guitarist. These musicians have figured out that beyond a certain level of financial security, more money doesn't increase life satisfaction. Fourth, there's a practical element. Many metal musicians are on tour for huge portions of the year. Why own a massive house that you're barely ever in? Why maintain multiple properties when you're living on a tour bus? The lifestyle of constant touring makes accumulating possessions and property more of a burden than a benefit. But there's also something deeper happening here. By living modestly despite their wealth, these metal musicians are making a statement about values. They're saying that success isn't measured by how much stuff you own. That you can be one of the most influential musicians in your genre and still drive a 10-year-old car. That wealth doesn't have to change who you are fundamentally. This stands in stark contrast to rappers and pop stars who often flaunt their wealth aggressively. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, luxury cars. These are status symbols that hip-hop and pop culture embrace. But in heavy metal, showing off wealth is seen as tacky and inauthentic. The culture actively discourages displays of luxury. There are exceptions, of course. Some metal musicians do live lavishly. Gene Simmons from Kiss is worth $300 million and lives like it, openly embracing his wealth and even bragging about it. But Gene is often criticized within the metal community for exactly that reason. Fans see him as a sellout, as someone who cares more about money than music. The extremely rich heavy metal stars who live like they're poor are making a choice every day to resist the temptations of wealth. They could buy anything they want. They could live however they want. But they choose simplicity, modesty, and staying grounded. Whether that choice comes from trauma, from cultural expectations, from genuine humility, or from some combination of all three, it sets heavy metal apart from other genres in a fundamental way. In heavy metal, you can be worth hundreds of millions and still be respected for living in a regular house and driving a regular car. You can be a legend who changed music forever and still shop at the same stores as everyone else. You can have enough money to never work again and still choose to live like the working-class kid you used to be. That's the paradox of wealth in heavy metal. The genre that sings about power and dominance is full of multimillionaires who refuse to live like they have power or dominance over anyone. The music that celebrates rebellion against authority is made by people who rebel against the expectation that wealth should change you. And the musicians who could live like kings Choose instead to live like regular people who just happen to have really successful jobs making really loud music. These extremely rich heavy metal stars who live like they're poor aren't suffering. They're not depriving themselves. They've just figured out that past a certain point, more money doesn't make you happier or more fulfilled. And in a culture obsessed with wealth and status, that realization might be the most metal thing about them.